7 mediums fled Whitmore Hall before the 8th night of my engagement, and I might have dismissed the whole affair as theatrical nonsense had the maid not walked into my chamber with eyes that were not her own and whispered words that stopped my heart. She said the ghost wanted her ring back from my finger. I must begin at the beginning, though even now, years later, the beginning feels like a dream I once had in a fever, all golden light and impossible hope. I was 23 years old when I met Lord Sebastian Hale, the 5th Earl of Whitmore, and I was nobody at all. My father had been a country clergyman of modest means and immodest kindness, the sort of man who gave away his supper to hungry parishioners and never seemed to notice that his own daughter's dresses were mended 3 times over. When he died of a winter cough that would not release him, I was left with £40, a trunk of books, and a letter of reference to a distant cousin in London who needed a companion for her elderly mother. I had resigned myself to a life of quiet servitude, reading aloud from improving texts and fetching shawls, when fate arranged for me to be standing in the corner of Lady Pemberton's drawing room on the very evening that Sebastian Hale walked through the door. I was not supposed to be at the party at all, of course. Companions do not attend parties, but the elderly Mrs. Pemberton had taken a liking to me and insisted I accompany her, though I was to sit in the corner and speak to no one unless spoken to. I wore my mother's old gray silk, let out and taken in so many times that it barely remembered its original shape, and I kept my eyes on my hands and tried to be invisible. But Sebastian saw me. I did not know who he was at first. I knew only that a tall man with dark hair and serious gray eyes had crossed the room and was standing before me, and that my heart had begun to beat in a way it never had before, quick and frightened, like a bird trapped against a window pane. He asked if the seat beside me was taken. I said it was not. He sat down, and my life divided itself into before and after. He was not handsome in the way of fairy tale princes. His features were too severe for that, his jaw too sharp, his brow too heavy. But there was something in his face that caught the light, a depth of feeling that seemed to flicker behind the careful mask of aristocratic composure, and when he looked at me, I felt seen in a way I had never felt before. He asked me about the book I held, a volume of Tennyson I had brought to occupy myself during the long hours of the party, and I told him it was my father's favorite. He asked about my father, and I told him. He asked about my life, and I told him that too, without meaning to, without understanding why this stranger's attention made me want to pour out every secret I had ever kept. By the end of the evening, I knew that Sebastian Hale was a widower. His wife had died 3 years ago, and he did not speak of how. I knew that he lived in a great house in Yorkshire called Whitmore Hall, and that he came to London rarely, only when business demanded. I knew that he found society exhausting and books more interesting than people, present company excepted. I knew that his smile, when it came, was slow and surprised, as if he had forgotten he knew how. And I knew, though I could not have explained how, that something had passed between us that night that would change everything. He called on me the next day, which was scandalous. Earls do not call on companions. The Pemberton household was thrown into delicious confusion, the servants whispering behind doors, Mrs. Pemberton's daughter regarding me with new and suspicious eyes. Sebastian seemed oblivious to the commotion. He asked me to walk with him in the park, and I went, though I knew I should not, though I knew that a woman in my position could not afford to inspire gossip. We walked for 2 hours. We talked about poetry and philosophy and the way the light fell through the winter branches. He told me about his home, the rolling hills and the ancient oaks, the way the morning mist rose from the valleys like something out of legend. He told me he had been lonely for a very long time, and that loneliness had become so familiar he had forgotten it was not simply the texture of existence. And then he stopped walking and turned to face me, and his eyes were full of something I did not dare to name. He said, "Miss Ashworth, I know this is madness. I know we have only just met. But I feel as though I have been waiting for you my whole life without knowing it. And now that you are here, I cannot bear the thought of letting you go." I did not know what to say. My practical mind told me this was impossible, that men like Sebastian Hale did not marry women like Eleanor Ashworth, that this was surely some elaborate jest, or worse, some dishonorable proposition dressed in pretty words. But my heart, my treacherous heart, knew only that I had never felt so alive as I did in his presence, and that the thought of returning to my quiet corner and my improving texts and my gray silk dresses made me want to weep. I said, "Lord Hale, we barely know each other." He said, "Then let me know you. Let me court you properly, if propriety is what you need. Let me prove that my intentions are honorable. Only say that you will not dismiss me out of hand, that you will give me a chance to show you what we might be together." I said yes. The courtship that followed was the happiest time of my life, though it was also the strangest. The Pembertons were scandalized, of course. An earl courting a companion was irregular at best, improper at worst, and Lady Pemberton's daughter, Miss Georgiana, made no secret of her displeasure. She had set her own cap at Sebastian, I learned later, and had been waiting for him to notice her through 3 entire seasons. To see him choose me, of all people, a penniless orphan with nothing to recommend her but a modest face and an immodest love of books, was more than her pride could bear. She took to making pointed comments whenever I passed, remarks about social climbers and fortune hunters and women who forgot their place. I bore it with what dignity I could muster, reminding myself that her unkindness came from disappointment rather than genuine malice. But it was hard those early weeks to navigate the treacherous waters of society with no family to guide me, no fortune to protect me, nothing but Sebastian's steadfast presence to shield me from the whispers. Sebastian himself seemed oblivious to the gossip, or perhaps he simply did not care. He had lived on the margins of society for years, I gathered, attending only the events he could not avoid, spending most of his time at Whitmore Hall or among his small circle of intellectual friends. The elaborate rituals of courtship seemed to bewilder him, and I found his bewilderment endearing, a sign that his interest in me was genuine rather than calculated. He took me to the British Museum one rainy afternoon, and we wandered for hours through galleries of ancient treasures, marveling at Egyptian mummies and Greek marbles and fragments of civilizations that had crumbled to dust long before England was even a name. He told me stories about each exhibit, weaving history and legend together with an ease that suggested he had spent years studying such things, and I listened, rapt, falling a little more in love with each word. He took me to a concert at St. James's Hall, where a string quartet played Mozart with such delicate precision that I wept without knowing why. He sat beside me in the darkness, his hand warm around mine, and when the music ended, he leaned close and whispered, "I have never enjoyed a concert so much as I have enjoyed watching you enjoy this one." He took me to bookshops in Charing Cross Road, dusty little establishments crammed with treasures where we spent hours browsing the shelves and debating the merits of various authors. He bought me a first edition of Jane Eyre, which he said reminded him of me, a woman of no fortune but great spirit, and I treasured that book more than any jewel he could have given me. But through it all, through the happiness and the wonder and the growing certainty that I had found my place in the world at last, there were shadows. Sebastian was attentive and ardent, calling every day, sending flowers and books and small, thoughtful gifts that showed he had listened to every word I said. He took me to concerts and galleries and quiet dinners at restaurants where the waiters looked at me as though I were a curiosity, a sparrow who had somehow wandered into a gathering of peacocks. He introduced me to his friends, such as they were, a small circle of scholars and artists who seemed genuinely fond of him and genuinely curious about the woman who had captured his heart. But there were shadows, too. He never spoke of his first wife, not after that first night. When I asked, gently, carefully, wanting to understand the man I was coming to love, his face would close like a door, and he would change the subject with a smoothness that might have seemed natural if I had not been watching so closely. the few times I pressed, he said only that Vivian had been beautiful and fragile and that her death had been a tragedy, and that he preferred not to dwell on painful memories. I accepted this because I wanted to accept it, because I was falling in love with him more deeply every day and did not want to see the clouds that gathered at the edges of our happiness. He proposed on a January evening in the conservatory of the house he had rented for the season, surrounded by orange trees and the scent of jasmine. He knelt before me and took my hand, and his voice trembled when he asked me to be his wife. I said yes before he had finished the question, and he laughed, a sound of such pure joy that I thought my heart would break from the beauty of it. And then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, and inside the box was a ring. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. An emerald, the color of deep forest shadows, surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight and scattered it like stars. The band was old gold, worn smooth by time, and I knew before he told me that this was not a new ring, not a ring chosen for me. This was a ring with a history, a ring that had belonged to someone else. Vivian's ring, he said, and his voice was strange, soft and distant. It has been in my family for generations. My grandmother wore it, and my mother, and then... He stopped, swallowed, composed himself. I would like you to wear it now, if you will. I would like you to be the one who gives it new meaning, new life. I should have hesitated. I should have asked questions. But he slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for me, and his eyes were so full of hope and love and something that might have been desperation that I could not refuse. I kissed him instead, and told him I would be proud to wear his ring, and tried not to think about the woman who had worn it before me. We traveled to Yorkshire a fortnight later so that I might see Whitmore Hall before the wedding. Sebastian was eager to show me the home that would be mine, the lands that would be our children's inheritance, the life we would build together in that ancient and beautiful place. I shared his eagerness, though mine was tinged with nervousness. I had never been inside a house so grand. I had never been mistress of anything but my own small trunk of belongings. I did not know if I could become the woman such a house required. But when the carriage crested the final hill and I saw Whitmore Hall spread before me in the winter twilight, my nervousness was swallowed by wonder. It was vast and gray and somehow somber, its towers rising against a sky streaked with the last colors of sunset, its windows glowing with warm light that promised shelter from the cold. Gardens stretched before it, formal and geometric, bare now but hinting at summer glory, and beyond the gardens, parkland rolled away into the purple distance, dotted with ancient trees and crossed by a silver ribbon of river. It looks like something out of a novel, I said, and Sebastian smiled. It is something out of a novel, he said. 300 years of novels, all piled on top of each other and patched together with tradition and stubbornness. I hope you will not find it too overwhelming. I found it enchanting. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, met us at the door and looked me over with the sharp assessment of a woman who had seen many things and been surprised by few of them. She was past 60, gray-haired and straight-backed, with eyes that seemed to take in everything and give away nothing. She welcomed me with perfect courtesy and not an ounce of warmth, and I understood that her true welcome would have to be earned, not given. The house was everything Sebastian had described and more. Room after room of beauty and history, portraits of ancestors glowering from walls, furniture that had been polished by generations of careful hands, carpets worn soft by centuries of footsteps. He showed me the library, which was larger than any room I had ever seen, lined floor to ceiling with books that smelled of leather and dust and forgotten wisdom. He showed me the music room, where a grand piano stood before tall windows that would fill with morning light. He showed me the dining room, and the drawing rooms, and the morning room and the gallery, and I tried to imagine myself belonging to all of this. Tried to picture my plain face among the jeweled beauties in the portraits, my worn dresses hanging in the vast wardrobes. But there were rooms he did not show me. I noticed, as we walked, that certain doors remained closed, certain corridors were passed by without comment. When I asked about the east wing, Sebastian's face flickered with something I could not read, and he said only that it was closed up, had been closed up for years, and there was nothing of interest there. I did not press. I was too happy to press, too full of love and wonder and the intoxicating sense that my whole life was about to begin. That night, I slept in a guest chamber that was larger than the entire cottage where I had grown up. The bed was hung with velvet curtains, and the fire burned warm in the grate, and I should have slept deeply and peacefully. But I did not sleep at all. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me, the creaks and groans of ancient timbers, the whisper of wind around the eaves. And sometime after midnight, when the fire had burned low and the room was filled with shadows, I heard something else. Footsteps. They came from above me, from the floor that Sebastian had not shown me, the east wing that was closed up with nothing of interest. Light footsteps, almost delicate, pacing back and forth, as though someone were walking the length of a room and then turning to walk it again. I told myself it was the wind, or the house settling, or my own imagination conjuring phantoms from tiredness and unfamiliar surroundings. But the footsteps continued, regular and rhythmic, and they sounded nothing like wind or settling timber. They sounded like a woman walking in the room above my head. I did not mention the footsteps to Sebastian the next morning. The daylight made them seem foolish, the nervous fancies of a woman unused to old houses and their peculiar noises. Besides, Sebastian was in such good spirits, so eager to show me the grounds and introduce me to the tenants and make plans for our future, that I did not want to trouble him with ghost stories. I pushed the memory aside and focused on the happiness before me. For a week we were perfectly content. I explored the house and gardens, always avoiding the closed east wing that Sebastian did not want me to see. I met the servants, who watched me with the wary curiosity of people who had learned that new mistresses could mean new troubles. I read in the magnificent library, and walked in the winter gardens, and sat by fires that blazed in hearths large enough to roast oxen. And every evening, Sebastian and I dined together and talked for hours, learning each other's minds and hearts, falling more deeply in love with every conversation. But the footsteps came every night, and they were not the only strangeness. On the third night, I woke to the scent of lilies. It was overwhelming, sweet and heavy, filling my room like visible fog. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked around for the source. There were no flowers in my room, no lilies anywhere in the house that I had seen. But the scent was unmistakable, thick as honey, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. On the fifth night, I passed a mirror in the gallery and caught a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, only my own pale reflection. But for just a moment, just a heartbeat, I had been certain I saw someone standing behind me, a woman in white with dark hair and a face I could not quite see. On the sixth night, I heard weeping. It came from the east wing, muffled by closed doors and empty corridors, but unmistakable. A woman's weeping, soft and hopeless, the kind of grief that has no comfort and no end. I lay in my bed and listened, and I thought of Vivian, beautiful and fragile, dead for 3 years, and I wondered what had happened in this house that Sebastian would not speak of. I tried to convince myself that there were rational explanations. The scent of lilies could be potpourri, forgotten in some cupboard. The flicker in the mirror could be a trick of candlelight. The weeping could be a servant's private sorrow, none of my business. But I did not believe my own explanations, and I could see that I was not the only one affected by the strangeness. The servants whispered when they thought I could not hear. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes followed me with something that might have been pity or might have been warning. And Sebastian, my dear Sebastian, grew pale and distracted, starting at sounds, watching me with an intensity that seemed half love and half fear. On the 7th night, I decided to tell him. We were sitting in the drawing room after dinner, the fire crackling between us, and Sebastian was staring into the flames with an expression I had come to recognize as his private melancholy, the sadness he tried so hard to hide. I gathered my courage and said, "Sebastian, I must tell you something." He looked up, and his eyes were wary. "What is it?" "I have been hearing things," I said. "At night, footsteps in the east wing, and last night, weeping. And there is a scent sometimes of lilies, though there are no lilies in the house." His face went white. For a long moment he said nothing, and I could see him struggling with something, some internal battle that I could not understand. Then he rose and crossed to me and took my hands, and his grip was almost painful. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I should have told you. I should have warned you before I brought you here. But I thought. I hoped." He stopped, closed his eyes, drew a breath. "There are things about this house, about my past, that I have not told you. I was afraid that if I told you, you would leave me, and I could not bear to lose you. But I see now that I cannot protect you with silence. I can only hope that the truth will not drive you away." He told me then about Vivian. He told me that she had been beautiful, yes, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, with dark hair and green eyes and a laugh that could light up any room. He told me that he had loved her desperately, blindly, the way young men love when they have not yet learned that love alone is not enough. He told me that she had been troubled, prone to dark moods and strange fancies, convinced that she could see things other people could not see, spirits and shadows and glimpses of the world beyond. "The doctors called it hysteria," Sebastian said, and his voice was bitter. "They prescribed rest and quiet and all the useless remedies of their profession. But Vivian did not want rest. She wanted answers. She became obsessed with spiritualism, with mediums and seances, and all the trappings of that world. She believed she was sensitive to the spirit realm, and she wanted to develop her gift to communicate with the dead." He paused, and I saw his hands tremble. "I tried to help her," he continued. "I brought her the best doctors, the most respected alienists. But nothing helped. She grew worse, more distant, more lost in her visions, and then, one night, He could not finish. But I understood. Vivienne had died in this house, and her death had not been natural, and Sebastian blamed himself. "I have never been certain," he said, "whether what she saw was real. Whether there are truly spirits in this house, or whether her troubled mind created phantoms that she made me see. But since her death, there have been occurrences, things I cannot explain. I have tried to ignore them, tried to tell myself that it is only grief and guilt playing tricks on me. But you have heard them too, and that means either I am not mad, or we both are." I took his face in my hands and made him look at me. "You are not mad," I said, "and neither am I. Whatever is happening in this house, we will face it together. I am not afraid." It was not entirely true. I was afraid. But I was more afraid of losing Sebastian, of letting fear drive me away from the man I loved and the life we could build together. I had spent my whole existence being sensible and cautious, accepting the limits that society placed on women of my station. I was not going to let a ghost, if ghost there was, take my happiness from me. Sebastian wept then, quietly, holding me tight, and I understood how alone he had been, how long he had carried this burden without anyone to share it. And I loved him more in that moment than I ever had before, because he was imperfect and frightened and haunted, and he had trusted me with his truth. The next morning, he sent for a medium. Her name was Mrs. Cordelia Finch, and she arrived with her assistant in a hired carriage, wrapped in black silk and wearing an expression of professional serenity. She was perhaps 50, with sharp eyes and capable hands, and a manner that suggested she had seen many things and been impressed by few of them. Sebastian explained the situation with admirable composure, describing the footsteps and the scents and the weeping, and Mrs. Finch listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, her face revealing nothing. When he finished, she rose and walked slowly around the drawing room, pausing at certain spots as though listening to something only she could hear. Then she turned to us, with an expression that was almost apologetic. "There is certainly a presence in this house," she said. "A strong one. A woman, I believe, connected to the East Wing. She is restless, searching for something. I will need to conduct a séance to learn more." We held the séance that evening, in a darkened parlor with candles flickering, and Mrs. Finch seated at a round table with her hands spread flat before her. Sebastian and I sat across from her. Our fingers linked, and I tried to quiet the pounding of my heart. This was not the world I knew, the rational, orderly world of parish churches and practical charity. This was something else entirely, something that brushed against the edges of everything I had been taught to believe. The room itself seemed to conspire with the ceremony. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the last of the winter light, and the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move with purpose, reaching toward us like curious fingers. Mrs. Finch had requested complete silence during the summoning, and the servants had been sent away, and the great house seemed to hold its breath around us. I could hear the clock in the hallway ticking, each second stretched and amplified in the stillness. I could hear the creak of Sebastian's chair as he shifted his weight, the soft rustle of Mrs. Finch's silk dress as she settled into her trance. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud as thunder in my ears, and I wondered if the others could hear it too. Mrs. Finch closed her eyes and began to speak in a low, rhythmic voice, calling out to any spirits who might be present, inviting them to make themselves known. Her words were old, formal, the kind of incantation that had been passed down through generations of practitioners. She spoke of the veil between worlds, of the thin places where the living and the dead might touch, of the spirits who lingered on this side, unable or unwilling to cross to the other. For long minutes, nothing happened. The candles burned steadily, the silence pressed down around us, and I began to wonder if this was all elaborate theater, a performance designed to part gullible people from their money. Mrs. Finch's assistant, a thin young man with spectacles and a nervous manner, sat in the corner taking notes, and I wondered what there could possibly be to note about such absolute stillness. Then the candles went out, all of them, at once, as though a great breath had swept through the room. In the sudden darkness, I heard Mrs. Finch gasp, and then she began to speak, but her voice was different now, higher and thinner, like the voice of a much younger woman. "He lied," she said, and the words seemed to come from somewhere far away. "He lied, and she knows, and the ring knows, and it will never be quiet until the truth is told. The ring remembers. The ring knows." And then she screamed. It was a terrible sound, raw and primal, and it cut off as suddenly as it had begun. Sebastian fumbled for matches, cursed, finally managed to strike a light. And in the flickering flame, I saw Mrs. Finch slumped in her chair, unconscious, her face as white as chalk. Her assistant rushed to her side, and it took several minutes of salts and cold water to revive her. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at Sebastian with an expression I will never forget. It was fear, pure and undisguised, the fear of someone who has seen something beyond comprehension. "I cannot help you," she said, and her voice shook. "I cannot stay in this house another moment. Whatever is here, it is beyond my abilities. I am sorry. I am so very sorry." She was gone within the hour, and she would not accept payment for her services. Sebastian was devastated, but he was also determined. He sent for another medium, a man this time, a Mr. Arthur Graves, who was said to have experience with particularly difficult cases. Mr. Graves was the opposite of Mrs. Finch in every way. Where she had been theatrical and mysterious, he was businesslike and brisk, arriving with a leather bag full of instruments and a manner that suggested he approached the supernatural with the same detachment a surgeon might bring to an operation. He walked through the house, taking measurements and making notes, and he spoke of electromagnetic disturbances and residual psychic energy as though they were as real and quantifiable as temperature or barometric pressure. I confess I found his approach oddly comforting. There was something reassuring about his certainty, his conviction that ghosts could be studied and understood and ultimately dealt with through proper scientific methodology. He set up equipment throughout the house, including a device he called a spirit telegraph, which was meant to allow communication with whatever entity dwelt in the East Wing. Sebastian and I watched him work, hope kindling in our hearts despite everything. But on the second night of his stay, Mr. Graves fled. I was awakened by the sound of running footsteps, heavy and panicked, pounding down the corridor outside my room. I threw on my wrapper and opened the door just in time to see Mr. Graves disappearing around the corner, his face a mask of pure terror. He did not stop to explain. He did not stop for his instruments or his notes or his carefully packed leather bag. He simply ran, and we did not see him again until morning, when Sebastian found him in the village inn, hunched over a glass of brandy, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He would not tell us what he had seen, not directly. He would only say that his scientific methodology had proved inadequate, that he had encountered something beyond the scope of his instruments to measure or his mind to comprehend. Mr. Graves lasted 2 nights before fleeing in the small hours of the morning, leaving behind only a hastily scribbled note that said, "This house is not haunted by a ghost. It is haunted by a wrong that demands to be righted. I cannot help you. God have mercy on you all." After Mr. Graves came Mrs. Blackwell, a stern woman from Edinburgh who claimed to have banished spirits from castles and keeps across Scotland. Mrs. Blackwell was formidable. She had iron-gray hair pinned severely back from her face and eyes that seemed to see through walls. She arrived with a trunk full of supplies, herbs and salts and candles of various colors, and a thick book written in a language I did not recognize. She spoke with the certainty of absolute faith, and she told us that whatever dwelt in Whitmore Hall would be driven out within the week. I wanted to believe her. After the failures of Mrs. Finch and Mr. Graves, Mrs. Blackwell's confidence was like a balm on raw nerves. She walked through the house with her book open, murmuring prayers and sprinkling salt, and the air itself seemed to lighten in her wake. Even the servants remarked upon it, saying that the house felt different, cleaner, as though a weight had been lifted. She conducted a cleansing ritual involving salt and sage and prayers in Latin, and for one blessed night the house was quiet. But on the second night, the footsteps returned louder than before, and Mrs. Blackwell was found in the morning huddled in a corner of her room, weeping and refusing to speak. I went to her, hoping I might coax from her some explanation, some understanding of what had broken her so completely. She had seemed so strong, so certain. To see her reduced to this huddled, trembling figure was more disturbing than any midnight footstep. She would not look at me at first. She kept her face pressed to her knees, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking back and forth like a child seeking comfort from invisible terrors. But when I spoke her name, softly, gently, she raised her eyes, and I saw something there that chilled me to the bone. "She knows you," Mrs. Blackwell whispered. "She knows you are here, and she knows about the ring, and she will not be silenced by salt or prayers or anything else. She is not a spirit seeking rest. She is a spirit seeking justice, and until justice is done, she will not stop." "What justice?" I asked, but Mrs. Blackwell would say no more. She left before breakfast, and we never learned what she had seen. Then came Signora Castellani, an Italian medium who specialized in what she called troubled souls. She was a small woman with an enormous presence, draped in scarves and jewels, her dark eyes lined with kohl in the Egyptian fashion. She spoke with a heavy accent and gestured expansively as she talked. And she told us stories of spirits she had helped to cross over, souls trapped by grief or anger or unfinished business, who had found peace through her ministrations. She seemed genuinely sympathetic to our plight, and unlike the others, she did not approach the haunting with either scientific detachment or religious fervor. She spoke of the spirit as though it were a person deserving of compassion, a woman who had suffered and was suffering still. "Let us not drive her out," Signora Castellani said. "Let us instead understand her. Let us learn what she needs, and perhaps we can give it to her, and she will go willingly to her rest." It seemed a gentler approach than what had come before, and I found myself hoping that gentleness might succeed where force had failed. She held 3 séances over 3 nights, and each time she made contact with what she called a powerful feminine presence, a spirit consumed by grief and rage. The séances were different from Mrs. Finch's theatrical productions. Signora Castellani did not call upon the spirits with dramatic invocations. Instead, she simply sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, waiting. And slowly, gradually, her face would change, her features shifting into expressions that were not her own. On the first night, she wept. Tears streamed down her cheeks, though her eyes remained closed, and she murmured words in a voice that was not hers, words about love and betrayal and terrible, terrible loneliness. On the second night, she spoke more clearly. She talked about a house that had been a prison, a husband who had been a stranger, a truth that had been buried along with her body. On the third night, the presence spoke through her, and its words were chilling. "She wears my ring. She sleeps in my house. She loves my husband, but she does not know. She does not know what he did. Ask him about the stairs. Ask him about the night I fell." Signora Castellani collapsed after that and had to be carried to her bed. In the morning, she told Sebastian that she could not continue, that the spirit was too strong and too angry, and that no cleansing could banish it because it did not want to be banished. It wanted justice. Sebastian tried to dismiss her words as the ravings of a charlatan, but I saw how they affected him. I saw the guilt that shadowed his eyes, the way he flinched when anyone mentioned stairs, the way he looked at me as though he were memorizing my face against the day when I would inevitably leave him. And I began to wonder, despite my love for him, despite my determination to believe in his goodness, whether there was something he had not told me, something worse than grief and guilt and a troubled wife. The 5th medium was a young man named Peter Harding, who came highly recommended by the Society for Psychical Research. He was calm and scientific, approaching the haunting as a phenomenon to be studied rather than a menace to be fought. Mr. Harding was barely 30, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an earnest manner that reminded me of the young curates who had assisted my father in his parish work. He treated Sebastian and me with gentle respect, and he did not dismiss our experiences as hysteria or imagination. He listened to everything we told him, taking careful notes, asking clarifying questions, treating the haunting as a puzzle to be solved rather than a horror to be fled. He set up equipment throughout the house, recording devices and thermometers and other instruments whose purpose I did not understand. He explained each device as he positioned it, telling us about temperature fluctuations that often accompanied spectral manifestations, about the acoustic properties of old houses, about the various theories current in psychical research about the nature of ghosts. He had a theory, he told us, that ghosts were not the souls of the dead at all, but rather a kind of psychic recording, an imprint left on the fabric of reality by moments of intense emotion. Perhaps, he suggested, we were not dealing with Vivian herself, but with an echo of her final moments, replaying endlessly like a phonograph record stuck in a groove. I found his theory strangely comforting. If Vivienne was not truly present, if she was only an echo, then perhaps there was nothing to be done except wait for the echo to fade. But Sebastian seemed disturbed by the idea, and I saw him watching the equipment with an expression I could not quite read. Mr. Harding spent hours interviewing the servants and reviewing the household records. I liked him, and I thought perhaps his rational approach might succeed where theatrical seances had failed. He was the first of the mediums who seemed to take the haunting seriously without being either frightened by it or eager to profit from it. But on his second night in the house, he too fled. He came to breakfast white-faced and trembling, and when Sebastian asked what had happened, he could barely speak. "I saw her," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "In the east wing. I saw her standing at the top of the stairs, and she looked at me. And her eyes." He shuddered, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and strange. Her eyes were full of such sorrow, such accusation. And then she pointed at me, and I felt as though she could see into my soul, as though she knew everything I had ever done wrong, every lie I had ever told, every small cruelty I had ever committed. "I cannot stay here. I cannot face that again." He left his equipment behind, all those careful instruments and recording devices, and we never saw him again. The sixth medium lasted only one night. Her name was Mrs. Clara Thornton, and she had been recommended by a friend of Sebastian's who swore she had helped his own family with a troublesome haunting in Cornwall. She was a comfortable, motherly woman, nothing like the dramatic Signora Castellani or the formidable Mrs. Blackwell. She patted my hand and told me not to worry, that she had dealt with far worse than a lovesick ghost, and that she would have everything sorted by morning. But morning found her gone. The only sign she had ever been there was a note left on her pillow, written in a hand that shook so badly it was barely legible. It said simply, "She is not lovesick, she is righteous, and the righteous cannot be turned aside." The seventh, a formidable woman named Mrs. Prudence Stone, who claimed to have never failed to resolve a haunting, fled before the first séance could even begin. She said the moment she entered the house, she knew she was not equal to what dwelt within it. She said the spirit was not merely restless, but righteous, and that no medium could banish righteousness. After Mrs. Stone's departure, Sebastian fell into a deep despair. He blamed himself for bringing me to this cursed house, for exposing me to horrors I should never have had to face. He offered to release me from our engagement, to send me back to London with enough money to live comfortably, to free me from the spectre of Vivian and whatever dark truth lay at the heart of the haunting. He said he loved me too much to trap me in his nightmare, but I refused. I had come too far, loved too deeply, invested too much of my heart and hope in this man and this life to abandon them now. Besides, I was curious. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was. The ghost, whatever it was, had spoken of secrets and lies, of stairs and falls, of a ring that remembered. If there was a truth to be uncovered, I wanted to uncover it, not to punish Sebastian, but to understand him, to free us both from the shadow that hung over our happiness. It was on the 8th night, the night after the 7th medium fled, that everything changed. I was sitting in my chamber, brushing my hair before the mirror, watching the candlelight play across my face and wondering if I looked different than I had before I came to Whitmore Hall. Older, perhaps. Wiser, certainly. More acquainted with the mysteries of existence than any practical clergyman's daughter had a right to be. The ring glittered on my finger as I moved, the emerald catching the light like a green eye winking at me from the depths. There was a knock at my door. I called for whoever it was to enter, expecting a maid come to tend the fire or turn down the bed. But the woman who entered was not one of the regular servants. She was young, perhaps my own age, with red hair and freckles and the lilting accent of Ireland in her voice. Her name, I would learn, was Nell, and she had been a housemaid at Whitmore Hall since before Vivian's death. She had been away visiting her sick mother for the past fortnight and had only just returned. "Begging your pardon, miss," she said, and her voice was strange, flat and far away, as though she were speaking in her sleep. "But there's someone who wants to talk to you. Someone who's been waiting a long time." I set down my brush. "Who wants to talk to me?" Nell did not answer. Instead, her eyes rolled back in her head, and when they returned, they were different. Darker, deeper, filled with an intelligence that was not her own. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming softer, more refined, with an accent I could not quite place. "So, you are the one who wears my ring," she said, and it was not a question. "You are the one who will marry my husband." I rose from my chair, my heart hammering. "Who are you?" "You know who I am, Eleanor Ashworth. You have heard me walking. You have smelled my lilies. You have wept at my weeping, though you did not know it was mine. I am Vivian Hale, and I have been waiting for someone who would listen." I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt strangely calm, as though this moment had been inevitable, as though all the strange events of the past weeks had been leading here. I looked at the woman who was and was not Nell, and I said, "Then tell me what you want me to know." And Vivian told me. She told me about her marriage to Sebastian, about the love that had burned so bright at the beginning and the distance that had grown between them as her visions intensified. She told me about the doctors and their useless cures, about the loneliness of being thought mad by the man she loved. She told me about discovering a terrible secret, something Sebastian had done before they married, something he had kept hidden from everyone. "He was engaged before me," Vivian said through Nell's lips, "to a woman named Charlotte Fairfax. She was sweet and gentle and utterly devoted to him, but she had no fortune, and his father demanded he marry money instead. So Sebastian broke the engagement, and Charlotte drowned herself in the river. I felt the blood drain from my face. Sebastian had never mentioned Charlotte Fairfax. He had never mentioned any engagement before Vivienne. He blamed himself," Vivienne continued. "As well he should, but he buried the guilt, buried it so deep that he almost forgot it existed. Until I found Charlotte's letters in the attic. Until I confronted him with what he had done." "What happened then?" I whispered. "We argued. The worst argument of our marriage. I accused him of being a murderer, and he accused me of being mad. I told him I would tell everyone, would expose his secret to the world. And then—" She paused, and Nell's face contorted with something that might have been grief or anger or both. "I fell," she said, "down the stairs of the East Wing. I was found the next morning, and they said it was an accident, said I had wandered there in one of my spells. But I did not wander. I did not fall. I was pushed. My hands were shaking. Are you saying Sebastian murdered you? I am saying I do not know." Vivian's voice was sad now, weary. "I do not remember the moment of my death. I remember the argument, and I remember standing at the top of the stairs, and then nothing, only darkness, and then waking to this half-existence, this limbo between worlds. I have been trapped here ever since, unable to move on, unable to rest. The ring binds me. As long as it remains in this house, I am bound." "The ring," I said, looking down at the emerald on my finger. "Your ring." "My ring," she agreed. "My prison. I have been trying to tell the mediums, trying to make them understand, but they are too frightened to listen. They feel my anger, and they flee. But you are different, Eleanor. You are not afraid. You are like me, in a way. An outsider in this world of wealth and privilege, looking for a place to belong. That is why I chose to speak through Nell. She is an outsider, too. She understands. What do you want me to do? I want you to find the truth. I want you to discover what happened on the night I died. Was it an accident? Was it murder? I must know, Eleanor. I cannot rest until I know." "And if Sebastian did kill you?" I asked, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. "What then?" "Then he must answer for what he did. But I do not ask for vengeance. I ask only for truth. The truth will set us both free." I looked at Nell, at Vivian, at the strange double presence before me. How will I find the truth? It happened 3 years ago. Everyone who was there that night is either dead or has had years to forget. Not everyone, Vivian said. Mrs. Blackwood was here. She found me at the bottom of the stairs. She has never spoken of what she saw, but she knows more than she tells. And there is one other, a witness that no one suspects. Who? Me, said Vivian. I cannot remember my death, but I can show you the night it happened. I can take you to the East Wing, to the place where I fell. If you wear my ring and stand where I stood, perhaps you will see what I cannot. It was madness, of course. Utter madness, the kind of thing a sensible woman would refuse without hesitation. But I was no longer certain I was a sensible woman. I had fallen in love with a man who might be a murderer, in a house that was certainly haunted, and I was wearing the ring of a dead woman who was speaking to me through the body of an Irish housemaid. Sensibility seemed rather beside the point. I will do it, I said. I will find the truth. Thank you, Vivian whispered, and I heard genuine gratitude in her borrowed voice. Thank you, Eleanor. You are braver than I was. Then her eyes closed, and Nell's body sagged, and when she opened her eyes again, they were her own, confused and frightened. She looked at me as though she had never seen me before, and she said, Miss, what happened? Why am I in your room? I told her that she had wandered in while sleepwalking, that everything was fine, that she should go back to bed. She accepted this explanation with the trust of the young, and she left me alone with my thoughts and my fear and the emerald ring that glittered like a green flame on my finger. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the darkness, watching the moon move across the ceiling, listening to the silence that was not quite silence, the settling of the old house, the distant murmur of wind. And I thought about Sebastian, about the man I loved, the man who had wept in my arms and begged me not to leave him. Could he have killed his first wife? Could the gentle, sorrowful man who read poetry to me and brought me flowers have pushed a woman down a staircase and watched her die? I did not want to believe it. Every fiber of my being rebelled against the possibility. But Vivian had spoken through Nell with such clarity, such conviction. Someone had been lying for 3 years, and until I discovered who, I could not trust anyone, not even the man I loved. The next morning, I went to find Mrs. Blackwood. I had spent the night tossing in my bed, Vivian's words echoing through my mind, replaying themselves like a melody I could not forget. She knows. The ring knows. Ask him about the stairs. Ask him about the night I fell. The ghost had spoken through 7 mediums, had driven 7 experienced practitioners of the spiritual arts to flee in terror, and yet somehow, through the simple body of an Irish housemaid, she had finally found the words to tell me what she needed. I understood now why the mediums had fled. They had felt Vivian's anger, her grief, her righteous fury, and they had known themselves inadequate to the task of addressing such powerful emotion. They were practitioners of the ethereal, comfortable with gentle spirits seeking release. But Vivienne was something else entirely. Vivienne was a woman who had been wronged, and she would not be silent until the wrong was acknowledged. The morning was gray and cold, a thin drizzle falling from clouds the color of old pewter. The house felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, more simply sad. As I walked through the corridors toward the kitchens, I passed servants going about their daily tasks, and I wondered how many of them knew the truth. How many had seen things they chose not to speak of? How many had their own suspicions about the night their former mistress died? I found her in the housekeeper's sitting room, a small chamber off the kitchens where she kept her accounts and dispensed orders to the junior servants. The room was warm from the kitchen fires, and it smelled of beeswax and lavender and the strong black tea that Mrs. Blackwood consumed by the potful. She looked up when I entered, and her face became a careful mask, revealing nothing. But I had learned to read that mask over the weeks I had spent at Whitmore Hall. I could see the wariness in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening of her lips that suggested she knew exactly why I had come. "Miss Ashworth," she said, "how may I help you? I need to ask you about the night Vivian died." The mask did not waver, but I saw her hands tighten on the pen she held. The knuckles went white for just a moment before she forced herself to relax. "I am sure I do not know what you mean, miss. Lady Hale died of an accidental fall. It was very tragic." I sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, and I tried to make my voice both firm and kind. "I know that you are loyal to this house. I know that you have served the Hale family for many years and that you take your duties seriously. But I also know that something happened in this house 3 years ago, something that has not been properly addressed. Vivian Hale is not at rest. Her spirit walks these halls, and she has been trying to tell someone the truth about her death. 7 mediums have fled from her anger, but I am not going to flee. I am going to stay, and I am going to find out what happened. And I would rather do it with your help than without." Mrs. Blackwood stared at me for a long moment. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between loyalty and conscience, between the comfortable silence she had maintained for 3 years and the burden that silence had placed upon her soul. Then she sighed, a small, weary sound, and her mask began to crack. "I know you found her," I continued, pressing my advantage. "I know you were the first to reach her after she fell. I need you to tell me what you saw." Mrs. Blackwood set down her pen. She folded her hands on the desk before her, and I could see them trembling slightly. She was silent for a long moment, and I could see her weighing something in her mind, deciding whether to trust me, whether to break a silence she had kept for 3 years. Then she sighed, a small, weary sound, and her mask began to crack. "Sit down," she said. "I will tell you what I know." I sat, and she told me. She told me that the night Vivian died had been stormy, rain lashing the windows and thunder shaking the walls. Lord and Lady Hale had argued at dinner, a terrible argument that the servants pretended not to hear, about some letters Lady Hale had found, some secret from his lordship's past. Lady Hale had fled to her rooms in the East Wing, and Lord Hale had followed, and there had been shouting, and then a scream, and then silence. Mrs. Blackwood had been the first to respond. She had run to the East Wing and found Vivian at the bottom of the great staircase, her neck broken, her eyes open and staring. Lord Hale had been standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at his wife's body with an expression that Mrs. Blackwood would never forget. It was not grief, she said, and her voice trembled. It was not shock. It was relief. For just a moment, before he noticed me, I saw relief on his face. "Do you think he pushed her?" Mrs. Blackwood shook her head. "I do not know. I saw no evidence of violence. She might have fallen. She was upset, perhaps not watching her step, and those stairs are steep and treacherous. It might have been an accident. But you do not believe that?" "No," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. "I do not believe that. But I have no proof, and Lord Hale is my employer, and accusing an Earl of murder without proof would destroy me. So I have kept my peace. I have kept my peace for 3 years. I thanked her for her honesty, and I left her to her accounts, and I went to the one place I had avoided since arriving at Whitmore Hall. I went to the East Wing. The corridor that led to the East Wing was off the main gallery, behind a door that looked like any other, but that none of the servants ever seemed to use. I had passed it dozens of times in my weeks at Whitmore Hall, and each time I had felt a slight chill, a whisper of unease, as though something on the other side of that door was aware of my presence and waiting. The door was locked, but I had watched where Mrs. Blackwood kept her keys in a cabinet in her sitting room that she thought no one else knew about. I took the one I needed without asking, slipping it into my pocket as I walked past. Perhaps it was wrong of me to steal from the housekeeper's keys, but I was beyond such considerations now. I needed answers. And the answers lay behind that locked door. The lock turned with a groan of protest, as though it had not been opened in a very long time, and the door swung open onto a corridor thick with dust and the smell of neglect. The air that rushed out to meet me was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of dried flowers and something else, something underneath, like old sorrow given physical form. No one had entered here in a long time. The paintings on the walls were covered with sheets, white shrouds that gave the corridor the appearance of a gallery of ghosts. The carpets showed no footprints but my own, the dust lying thick and undisturbed. Cobwebs hung from the wall sconces, and the gas jets had long since been turned off, leaving the corridor lit only by the gray light that filtered through dirty windows at the far end. I walked down the corridor, following the path Vivian must have walked on the night she died. Each step sent up small clouds of dust that swirled around my skirts, and each step seemed to take me further from the world I knew and deeper into something else, a place between life and death, between memory and reality. The walls seemed to press in around me, and the silence was absolute, not even the sounds of the house penetrating this forgotten space. I could hear my own breathing, loud and harsh in the stillness, and I could hear the rustle of my dress against the dusty carpet, and beyond that, nothing. It was as though the East Wing existed in a bubble, separate from the rest of the world, a place where time had stopped and even sound was afraid to enter. At the end of the corridor, I found the stairs. They were grander than I had expected, a sweeping curve of marble that descended into darkness. I could see why someone might fall here. The steps were steep, and there was no railing on the outer edge, only a sheer drop to the hard floor below. I stood at the top and looked down, and I felt a cold wind touch my face, though there were no windows open, no source of draft, and then I felt something else. A presence behind me, a breath on my neck, a whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head. "See," Vivian's voice said, "see what I saw," and the world changed. The transition was not gradual. One moment I was standing in the dusty silence of the East Wing, surrounded by the detritus of 3 years of neglect. The next moment, I was somewhere else entirely, or rather, I was in the same place. But the place itself had been transformed. I was no longer standing in the dusty silence of the East Wing. I was standing in the same place, but it was 3 years ago, and the corridor was lit with gas lamps, and I could hear the storm raging outside. Rain lashing the windows with such fury that the glass seemed to bow inward with each gust. And I was not Eleanor Ashworth. I was Vivian Hale. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not like watching a play or reading a book. It was like becoming someone else entirely, like slipping into another skin. I felt what she had felt. The anger, burning and righteous, like a flame in my chest that would not be extinguished. The betrayal cutting like a knife, sharp and clean and deep. She had loved Sebastian, loved him with all her heart, given him everything she had to give, and he had lied to her. He had driven a woman to her death and hidden it, and he had dared to accuse her of madness when she confronted him with the truth. The rage was overwhelming. It filled me, consumed me, until I could barely remember that I was Eleanor Ashworth and not Vivian Hale, until the boundary between us blurred and shifted like watercolors in the rain. I turned, and Sebastian was there, his face contorted with fear and fury. He looked younger than the man I knew, younger and somehow smaller, diminished by his terror. He was shouting, but I could not hear the words, only the emotion behind them. Panic, desperation, the terror of a man whose secrets are about to be exposed, who sees his carefully constructed life crumbling around him and does not know how to stop it. He was not a monster, I realized in that strange doubled consciousness. He was a frightened man, a weak man, a man who had never learned to face the consequences of his actions. He had built his life on lies and evasions, and now the foundation was giving way, and he did not know how to survive the collapse. I saw him reach for me. I saw myself step back. I saw my foot miss the edge of the stair, felt the sickening lurch as balance deserted me. The moment of suspension when the body knows it is falling, but the mind has not yet caught up. And then I was falling, tumbling through darkness, the world spinning around me in a blur of shadow and light, and the last thing I saw was Sebastian's face at the top of the stairs, not reaching to save me, not crying out in horror, just watching me fall with that expression Mrs. Blackwood had described, relief. I came back to myself with a gasp, standing at the top of the stairs, clutching the wall to keep from falling. My heart was racing, my skin was drenched in cold sweat, and I knew the truth. Sebastian had not pushed Vivian, but he had not saved her either. He had watched her fall and done nothing, and in that moment, his inaction had been as good as murder. He had wanted her to die. He had let her die. And then he had covered it up, called it an accident, buried the truth along with his wife's body. I do not know how long I stood there, processing what I had seen, trying to reconcile the man I loved with the man in the vision. They were the same man, I realized. The guilt that shadowed Sebastian's eyes, the despair that clung to him like a second skin, the desperate need for absolution that had drawn him to me, all of it came from this moment, from the choice he had made at the top of these stairs. He was not a murderer in the legal sense, but he was not innocent either. He had wished for his wife's death, and his wish had come true, and he had been paying for it ever since. I descended the stairs slowly, carefully, and at the bottom, I found what I had not expected to find. A door, hidden in the shadows beneath the staircase, half open, leading to a small chamber I had not known existed. I pushed the door open and went inside. The chamber was clearly a private study, a place where someone had come to escape the world. There was a desk by the window, covered with papers and books, and a chair that still bore the imprint of someone who had sat in it often. The air smelled of old roses and dust and something else, something familiar. Lilies. I went to the desk and began to sort through the papers. Most were household accounts, guest lists, invitations to parties long since past. But beneath the mundane correspondence, I found what I was looking for: letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Letters from Charlotte Fairfax to Sebastian Hale, written in a girlish hand that spoke of love and hope and innocent trust. The last letter was dated 3 days before Charlotte's death, and it spoke of her excitement for their upcoming wedding, her dreams of the life they would build together. She had not known. When she wrote this letter, Charlotte had not known that Sebastian was about to break her heart, to abandon her for a wealthier bride, to shatter the dreams she had so carefully constructed. She had written these words believing herself loved, and within a week she would be dead at the bottom of a river, driven there by the man who had promised to cherish her forever. I felt sick. I felt betrayed. I felt as though the ground beneath my feet had crumbled away, leaving me suspended over an abyss of uncertainty and grief. But I also felt something else: understanding. Sebastian had been young when he abandoned Charlotte, young and weak and desperate to please a father who valued money above love. He had made a terrible choice, and that choice had led to a woman's death, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to outrun the guilt. Vivian had been his attempt at redemption, a chance to love someone without the shadow of his past. But redemption had proved impossible, because the truth had a way of surfacing, and when it did, he had let another woman die rather than face it. Was that the man I loved? Was that the man I wanted to marry? I did not know. I only knew that I could not make a decision without confronting him, without hearing his side of the story, without giving him the chance to explain. Perhaps there was no explanation. Perhaps he was simply a coward and a monster, and I had been a fool to love him. But I owed it to myself and to the woman I might become as his wife to find out. I gathered the letters and left the hidden study. I walked out of the east wing and down the long corridors to the main part of the house. I found Sebastian in the library, staring into the fire with that expression of melancholy that I now understood far better than I had before. "We need to talk," I said. He looked up, and his face changed when he saw what I held. The letters. Charlotte's letters. The proof of everything he had tried to hide. "Where did you find those?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "In the East Wing, in Vivian's study, where she found them before she died." He closed his eyes. "I see." I sat down across from him, and I laid the letters on the table between us. "Tell me the truth," I said. "All of it. I need to know everything before I can decide whether to stay." And Sebastian told me. He told me about Charlotte, about the love they had shared when they were young and naive and believed that love was enough. He told me about his father's ultimatum, marry money or be disinherited, and the impossible choice he had faced. He told me about the letter he had written, breaking the engagement, and the days of silence that followed. And then the news that Charlotte had walked into the river and never walked out again. "I wanted to die," he said. "When I heard what she had done, I wanted to follow her, but I was too much of a coward even for that. So I lived, and I hated myself, and I tried to forget. I married Vivian because she was beautiful and rich, and my father approved, and because I thought if I could make her happy, it would somehow make up for what I had done to Charlotte. But happiness was beyond me. Every time Vivian smiled, I saw Charlotte's face. Every time she told me she loved me, I heard Charlotte's voice. I was haunted long before Vivian died." "And the night she fell?" I asked. "What happened that night?" Sebastian's face crumpled. "She found the letters," he said. "She confronted me. She called me a murderer, and she was right. I had killed Charlotte as surely as if I had pushed her into that river myself. Vivian said she would tell everyone, would expose my secret to the world. And I was terrified. Not of scandal, not of ruin, but of seeing myself through other people's eyes, of having everyone know what I truly was." "Did you push her?" "No," he said, and he looked at me with eyes full of anguish. "I swear to you, Eleanor, I did not push her, but I did not save her either. She stepped back, and she fell, and for just a moment, just one terrible moment, I was glad. I was glad she was dead, because it meant my secret would die with her. And then the moment passed, and I realized what I had done, what I had become, and I have not known a moment's peace since." "Why did you not save her?" I asked. "You could have reached for her. You could have tried." "I do not know," he said, and his voice broke. "I have asked myself that question every day for 3 years, and I do not know. I was frozen. I was a coward. I let her die, and I have been dying myself ever since." We sat in silence for a long time after that, the fire crackling between us, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. I looked at the man I loved, the man who had lied and failed and caused the deaths of 2 women through his weakness. I looked at his broken eyes and his trembling hands and the lines of suffering carved into his face, and I made my decision. "I cannot marry you," I said, "not as things stand, not with all this darkness between us." His face went gray. "I understand. But I did not say I would never marry you. I said not as things stand. Things can change, Sebastian. You can change. You have carried this guilt alone for too long, letting it poison everything you touch. It is time to face it, openly, honestly, however painful that may be." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Charlotte's family deserves to know the truth. They deserve to understand why she died, to know that it was not their failure or hers, but yours. And Vivian deserves to rest. She has been trapped in this house for 3 years, bound by the ring and the secrets it represents. If we are ever to have a future, we must first set the past to rest." Sebastian stared at me. "You are asking me to confess, to ruin myself." "I am asking you to be brave," I said. for perhaps the first time in your life. I am asking you to face the consequences of what you have done, to accept responsibility, to make what amends you can. It will be hard. It may destroy your reputation, your standing, your fortune, but it is the only way forward, for you and for me." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "And if I do this? If I confess, if I face the consequences, will you stay?" "I do not know," I said honestly. "I cannot promise you forgiveness, and I cannot promise you a future, but I can promise you this. If you do not do this, if you choose silence and secrecy again, I will leave, and I will not come back." He looked at me with something that might have been gratitude, might have been love, might have been the first stirring of the courage he had never possessed. Then he nodded. "I will do it," he said, "for Charlotte, for Vivian, and for you, if you will let me." It took time to arrange. There were letters to write, appointments to keep, explanations to make. Sebastian wrote to Charlotte's family, a long and painful letter confessing everything, begging their forgiveness while expecting none. He wrote to his solicitors, instructing them to make whatever financial amends were possible, whatever gestures of restitution might ease the suffering he had caused. He wrote to Vivian's family, too, telling them the truth about her death, about the argument and the fall and his own terrible inaction. The scandal, when it broke, was everything he had feared. The newspapers were relentless. They had found a delicious story, an earl brought low by his own confessions, and they wrung every drop of sensation from it. There were headlines about tragedy and betrayal, about a young woman drowned and a wife fallen, about the dangers of aristocratic privilege and the darkness that lurked behind the grand facades of England's stately homes. Sebastian's name was dragged through the mud, his family's history examined and found wanting, his character dissected by writers who had never met him and did not care about truth, only circulation. Society turned its back on him. Friends who had once sought his company suddenly found themselves otherwise engaged. Invitations that had once arrived by the dozen now ceased entirely. At church on Sundays, the pews around us remained conspicuously empty, and the vicar's sermons seemed always to touch on themes of sin and confession and the terrible price of wrongdoing. I felt the weight of 100 eyes upon us, judging, condemning, watching for any sign of weakness they could carry back to their drawing rooms as fresh gossip. The newspapers published carefully worded insinuations, and the whispers in drawing rooms were not careful at all. Sebastian Hale, the Earl of Whitmore, had been revealed as a coward and a cad, a man whose weakness had led to the deaths of 2 women. Some called him a murderer, though he had never been charged with any crime. Others called him worse, names I will not repeat here, names that cut to the bone and left scars that might never heal. But something strange happened in the midst of the ruin. Sebastian began to heal. I watched him in those terrible weeks, watched him face the consequences of his actions with a dignity I had not known he possessed. The man I had fallen in love with, the man who had seemed so burdened by secret sorrows, began to stand straighter. The shadows under his eyes began to fade. The tremor that had always lurked in his voice, barely perceptible but always present, grew still. He did not make excuses. He did not blame others. He accepted the condemnation of society with the quiet resignation of a man who knows he deserves it. And as he accepted it, as he stopped running from his guilt and allowed it to wash over him, I saw the darkness begin to lift from his eyes. He was not happy. How could he be? But he was free in a way he had never been before, free of the secrets and lies that had poisoned his existence. He could look at himself in the mirror without flinching. He could speak of Charlotte and Vivian without his voice breaking. He could face the world, however hostile that world had become, without the constant terror of exposure. And as I watched him change, I found my own feelings beginning to shift. I had told him I could not promise forgiveness, and I had meant it. What he had done was unforgivable, in the strictest sense of the word. 2 women were dead because of his weakness, and no amount of confession or restitution could bring them back. But forgiveness was not the same as understanding, and understanding was not the same as compassion. I had learned the whole truth about Sebastian Hale, the good and the terrible, the nobility and the cowardice. And I had discovered that I could hold both in my heart at once, that loving someone did not mean approving of everything they had done, that redemption was a process rather than a destination. One night, a month after the scandal broke, I went to the East Wing. I had visited several times since my conversation with Vivian, bringing candles and flowers, and sitting at the top of the stairs where she had fallen. I spoke to her, told her what was happening, assured her that the truth was finally being told. But I had never felt her presence, never heard her voice. The haunting had stopped the moment Sebastian began his confession. The footsteps, the weeping, the scent of lilies, all had disappeared, as though Vivian had finally found the peace she had been seeking. But I went one last time, because I had something to do. I stood at the top of the stairs, the ring glittering on my finger, and I spoke into the silence. "Vivian," I said, "I know you are free now. I know you have found rest. But before you go completely, I want you to know, the ring is yours. It was always yours. I am going to give it back." I slipped the ring from my finger. It was hard to do. I had grown accustomed to its weight, its presence, the way it caught the light. But it did not belong to me. It had never belonged to me. It was Vivian's ring, and Vivian's memory, and Vivian's claim on the man we had both loved. I placed the ring on the top step of the staircase, where Vivian had stood on the night she died, and as I did, I felt a breath of warmth touch my cheek like the brush of invisible lips, and I heard a voice, so faint I might have imagined it. "Thank you, Eleanor. Be happy." And then she was gone. I left the East Wing for the last time and closed the door behind me. When I returned to the main part of the house, Sebastian was waiting for me, his face anxious. "What happened?" he asked. "Where did you go?" I showed him my bare finger. "I gave it back," I said. "The ring." I returned it to Vivian, his eyes filled with tears. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did. It was never mine to keep. But now that it is gone, now that she is at peace, I think we can finally begin." "Begin what?" "Begin again," I said, "if you still want to. If you can love a woman without a fortune, without a family, without anything to offer but herself." He took my hands, his grip warm and steady. "Eleanor," he said, "you are everything I never deserved and everything I have ever wanted. If you can find it in your heart to stay, I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of you." I did not answer with words. I answered with a kiss, the first real kiss we had shared since the truth came out, and in that kiss was everything I could not say. The forgiveness that was not quite forgiveness, the love that was bruised but not broken, the hope that was fragile but real. We were married 3 months later in a small ceremony in the village church, with no society guests and no elegant reception. The church was old and simple, its stone walls worn smooth by centuries of worship, its windows filled with plain glass that let in the pale winter light without the distraction of color. There were no flowers, for it was too early in the year for flowers, but someone, I never learned who, had woven evergreen boughs around the altar, and the scent of pine and cold stone filled the air. I wore a dress of cream-colored wool, simple and warm, that I had made myself with the help of one of the younger maids. It was not the wedding dress I might once have dreamed of, not the cascades of silk and lace that society brides wore to their grand cathedral weddings. But it was honest, and it was mine. And when I walked down the aisle toward Sebastian, I felt more beautiful than I had ever felt in my life. Mrs. Blackwood came, and Nell, and a handful of servants who had chosen to stay despite the scandal. Cook had made a wedding cake, a modest thing by the standards of great houses but beautiful to my eyes, decorated with sugar flowers and our initials intertwined. The footmen had polished their buttons, and the maids had pressed their best aprons, and they stood in the back of the church like a family I had not known I had, watching as I pledged my life to the man I loved. Sebastian's friends from the scholarly and artistic world came too, the ones who valued character over reputation and saw in his confession a courage that society could not recognize. There was a poet who had known Sebastian at university, a thin man with wild hair and wilder eyes who wept openly during the vows. There was a painter who had once done Sebastian's portrait, a woman of middle years who clasped my hands after the ceremony and told me I had more strength than anyone she had ever met. There was a professor of ancient languages, a philosopher who had written books on ethics and morality, a retired colonel who had served with Sebastian's father and who remembered the boy Sebastian had been before tragedy made him the man he became. It was not the grand wedding I might once have dreamed of, but it was honest, and it was real. And as I spoke my vows, I knew that I was not marrying a fairy tale prince or a perfect man. I was marrying Sebastian Hale, with all his flaws and failures, all his guilt and his hard-won redemption. I was choosing him with open eyes, knowing exactly what I was getting. And that, I think, is the truest kind of love. We lived at Whitmore Hall, Sebastian and I, for many years after. The scandal faded, as scandals do. New gossip replaced the old, and the world moved on to fresh outrages. Some doors remained closed to us forever, but we found we did not mind. We had each other, and the books in the library, and the gardens that I tended with my own hands, and eventually, in time, the sounds of other voices, small feet running down the long corridors, laughter echoing where once there had been only silence. The east wing remained closed for the first year of our marriage. I could not bring myself to enter it, and Sebastian could not bear to. But on our first anniversary, we opened it together, and we found it changed. The dust was gone, the sheets removed from the paintings, the air fresh and clean as though the windows had been open for weeks. On the top step of the staircase, where I had left Vivian's ring, there was nothing. She took it, I said, and I felt no fear, only peace. She is truly gone. Sebastian put his arm around me, and we stood there for a long moment, looking down the staircase that had witnessed so much pain. Then he said, "What shall we do with this wing? We cannot leave it empty forever." I thought about it. Then I smiled. "A library," I said. "A new library, separate from the old one, where anyone can come to read. Open to the village, to the tenants, to anyone who wants to learn. A place of light and knowledge where the shadows of the past can finally be put to rest." Sebastian looked at me with wonder, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "You would do that? You would turn this place of death into a place of life?" "That is what Vivian wanted," I said. "Truth and freedom and a future unshackled from the past." What better memorial could we give her? The library opened the following spring. It was modest at first, just a few hundred books and some comfortable chairs arranged in what had been Vivian's sitting room. The walls were freshly painted in warm yellow, the color of sunshine and hope, and the windows had been cleaned until they sparkled, letting in great floods of light that banished every shadow. We had set up reading tables and desks, brought in lamps for the darker corners, created a children's section with picture books and fairy tales, and an area for serious study with dictionaries and encyclopedias and volumes of history and science. The villagers came slowly at first, suspicious of charity from the disgraced Earl and his upstart wife. They peered through the windows, whispered among themselves, wondered what the catch might be. But the books were free to borrow, and the fire was always warm, and gradually, one by one, they began to come inside. I remember the first child to take a book home. She was a girl of perhaps 10, the daughter of one of our tenant farmers, with red cheeks and curious eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she accepted the volume I handed her. It was a book of fairy tales, illustrated with beautiful pictures, and she held it as though it were made of gold and glass, something precious and fragile that might shatter if she breathed too hard. "I hope you enjoy it," I told her. And she looked at me with an expression I will never forget. "No one has ever lent me a book before," she said. I did not know books could belong to everyone. It grew over the years, fed by donations and purchases and the boundless enthusiasm of the villagers who had never had such access to learning before. We added more rooms, more shelves, more books. We started reading groups for adults and story hours for little ones. We hired a proper librarian, a young woman from the village who had taught herself to read from borrowed newspapers and who approached books with the reverence others reserved for religious texts. Sebastian himself spent hours there, reading to anyone who wanted to listen, teaching those who wanted to learn. The guilt that had defined him for so long transformed into something else, a drive to give back, to make amends not through punishment, but through service. I would find him sometimes in the evenings, surrounded by a circle of children, telling them stories from history or mythology, or simply making things up as he went along, and the joy on his face made my heart sing. The scandal never entirely faded. There were always whispers, always those who remembered and judged. But there were also those who forgave, or at least chose to see the man Sebastian had become rather than the man he had been. And as the years passed, as the library grew and flourished, as Sebastian proved his worth through countless small acts of kindness and generosity, the balance slowly shifted. And I found the life I had never dared to dream of. Not as a countess, though that title was mine by law. Not as the mistress of a great house, though I managed it with Mrs. Blackwood's grudging help. But as a woman who had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, who had loved imperfectly and been loved imperfectly in return, who had learned that forgiveness was not a gift you gave to others, but a burden you released from yourself. Nell stayed with us, promoted from housemaid to lady's maid to trusted companion. She never remembered the night when Vivian had spoken through her, or if she did, she never mentioned it. But sometimes I caught her looking at me with an expression that suggested she knew more than she said, and I wondered if Vivian had left some small piece of herself behind, some spark of connection that would never quite fade. Mrs. Blackwood softened over the years, as much as a woman of her temperament could soften. She never quite approved of me, I think. This upstart clergyman's daughter who had stumbled into an earl's bed. But she respected me, which was enough, and we built a working partnership that kept Whitmore Hall running smoothly through all the changes that came. Charlotte Fairfax's family never responded to Sebastian's letter. I cannot blame them. Some wounds are too deep for words, some losses too great for any gesture of restitution. But we learned years later that Charlotte's younger sister had used the money Sebastian sent to establish a school for girls in her village, and that the school bore Charlotte's name. It was not forgiveness, but it was something, a small light kindled from great darkness. And Vivienne? I never saw her again, never heard her footsteps, or smelled her lilies, or felt her presence in the shadows. The ring never reappeared, though I sometimes wondered where it had gone, whether it had simply vanished into the ether, or whether Vivian had taken it with her to whatever place awaited beyond this world. I liked to think she was at peace, that she had found the truth she sought and the rest she deserved. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and the world seemed thin and strange, I would stand at my window and look out at the moonlit gardens, and I would remember. I would remember a young woman with dark hair and green eyes, a woman who had loved the same man I loved and had been destroyed by his weakness. I would remember her voice speaking through Nell's lips, her request that had changed everything, her gratitude when I agreed to help. And I would whisper into the darkness, "Thank you, Vivienne, for giving me the chance to know the truth, for setting us both free." The wind would stir the curtains, and somewhere in the distance, an owl would call, and I would smile and return to bed, to the warmth of my husband's arms, to the life we had built from the ruins of the past. 7 mediums fled Whitmore Hall, but I stayed. I stayed because I was stubborn and curious and in love with a man who did not deserve me. I stayed because a ghost asked me to find the truth, and finding the truth was easier than running from it. I stayed because I learned that the past does not have to imprison us, that guilt can be transformed and love can survive even the deepest betrayals. The ring is gone now, returned to its rightful owner. The ghost is at rest. The secrets have been told, and the wounds have begun to heal. Whitmore Hall stands in the Yorkshire hills as it has stood for 300 years, but it is no longer a house of shadows. It is a house of light, of learning, of second chances. And I, Eleanor Ashworth, who was once nobody at all, have found my place at last. This is my story. This is how I came to love a haunted man and live in a haunted house and learn that the greatest haunting of all is the one we carry within ourselves, the ghosts of our own failures and fears and unforgiven sins. But ghosts can be laid to rest, the past can be released, and love, imperfect and complicated and hard-won, can flourish even in the darkest of places. I know because I have lived it. I am living it still.